This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, lay doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Neil Roberts, Associate Dean of the Faculty and Professor of Africana Studies at Williams College. Along with numerous articles in academic journals, he is the author of Freedom is Marronage from 2015, and the editor or co-editor of Creolizing Rousseau from 2014, Journeys in Caribbean Thought from 2016, and a political companion to Frederick Douglass from 2018. In this conversation, we discuss the place of Caribbean history and thought in Black studies, the complexity of thinking freedom in the Black Atlantic world, and the challenges that have come with the institutionalization of the field. Hello, Neil. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you doing today?
Okay, well, I'm very delighted to be reasoning with you, John.
Well, I'm really excited to have a chance to talk to you. You know, we've been friends for quite a while now. We were talking beforehand, and this is a really important part of this for me personally, which is we had these kinds of conversations there at Williams College when I was a professor at Amherst College, gathering all kinds of people in New England together to talk about, what's the future of Black studies. Mm-hmm. And it has always been on my mind how that was this really wonderful meeting and really interesting people from New England. And we got a lot of conversations started, and it really didn't quite have an outlet. And so I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that moment as part of my motivation for starting this series is that question, like, how can I continue? How can I contribute to that conversation that was started? I don't even want to talk about how many years ago that was.
Yeah.
It was probably like 17 years ago.
I still have the picture. I still have the picture somewhere. It was a really wonderful, wonderful time.
Yeah, and I have a picture of my first kid running around some glory house on the edges of Williams College. He's a little kid, and now he's a junior in college, so that's how we calculate
that's right.
those things. But it's really great to have you here. I really love your work, and I think your relation to the field of Black studies is interesting. So look forward to talking about how you imagine the field, how you think about its future, how you see your place in it. But really, before we get started on these questions about you and your work and your reflections on the field, I wanted to ask you to just sort of narrate for us, what drew you to the study of Black life? What got you interested in Black studies? And what sustained your work in the field?
Yeah. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And so when thinking about my connection to Black studies, I really have to go back to my experience as an undergraduate. So I was an undergraduate at Brown University in the 1990s, the mid to late 1990s. And I actually intended and hoped to, as a vocation, to be a professional soccer player or a footballer, whatever part of the world one is from. And so I actually had applied to all of the colleges I applied to as an undeclared major. There were only two that I applied to that had required you to state it. And for those that did, I actually had said that I wanted to be a chemistry major because I ended up, I was very interested in chemistry.
Chemistry?
Chemistry.
It would take me a while to guess that.
And so I had a high school chemistry teacher who for 50 years worked in industry as a chemist and then decided in their 70s that they wanted to be a high school teacher. And making a long story short, when I was in high school, there was a program that the NAACP sponsored called ACT-SO. And so going back to soccer, I had a coach who was one of my most longstanding club team coaches who then had kidney stones. And it was the first time. This was someone who was very kind of stoic in their resolve, and for a good portion of a half of a year was really visually in pain most of the time, because at the time, kidney stones, there were two ways to treat it: either to have radiation, and there were at the time unintended, potentially cancerous consequences of that radiation, or to naturally have the body go. So I ended up doing a project with my high school teacher outside of the class that actually I have it somewhere. It was to use lead sulfate to basically, I imagine like taking like a pill, like almost like a, just a little small pill, chewable pill that you could just take, and then it would dissolve it in the body. And but that was connected to again, this, what I saw as this vocation, that I would go to college. What is now the MLS, Major League Soccer, was just forming. Jamaica, which is where I'm originally kind of born, the Jamaican men's national team had for the first time qualified for the World Cup. And I knew a friend of mine who was on the Jamaican national team, who was at the University of Rhode Island while I was at Brown. So I really thought I would go to college, take a few classes, and that would be that. Fast forwarding my sophomore year at Brown University, I ended up signing for a class on African American literature while I was in season in the fall. And it was taught by a faculty member who, because at the time I just thought everyone's a faculty member. I didn't have distinctions between who's an adjunct, who's an assistant professor, who's a full professor, who's a president teaching a class. And I taught a class by a faculty member who was actually a Haitian anthropologist, who was the special advisor to the then president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And Aristide had just been overthrown in a coup. And there was a bounty on my professor's head. There was a death kind of bounty on his head. Jeez. And he somehow managed, because of the kind of the Caribbean intellectual diasporic network, to attain a visiting position at Brown. And so it was actually in that class. So the irony, a Caribbean anthropologist who was this political advisor who actually taught me African American, and it was American in the U.S. national sense, not America's sense. And so that was the first time that I read Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, Booker T. Washington, Up From Slavery, some work by Zora Neale Hurston, and some other kind of figures in this kind of overview. And at the end of the, near the end of the course, he said, I know you're, want to be this professional soccer player, but he had mentioned a couple summer programs that that were geared towards students from historically underrepresented groups that were encouraging them to apply to kind of doctoral programs. And I just kind of took it, just like a leaflet, just like you would take any. At college or colleges, universities, at the beginning of the orientation of first years, where you see a bunch of tables and you take a leaflet. It was really kind of like that. It wasn't you must do this. It was just this. I saw this leaflet, and I could say other things, but that was really the beginning of the connection. And so when I did initially declare a major, Brown was one of the few undergraduate institutions in which you could declare a major in public policy. So I actually did a law and public policy track, and that's what I thought I was going to do, even though I had taken courses in what was then the Afro-American Studies program, and that faculty member I mentioned was a visiting professor in English. And halfway through my time as an undergraduate, there were not only one faculty member who was a sociologist who started publishing in Caribbean philosophy, but also there was someone who was hired who was an Africana philosopher. And so I did also a second kind of BA in the Afro-American Studies program. And so that was the beginning. I'll pause there, but that was really the beginning of no connection, so to speak, to a loose connection to the field of Black studies, to something that could be considered more intentional, even though I didn't have a sense of the horizon of what that would mean. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of my favorite questions to ask in this series. That people have such interesting ways that they get looped into the field, and how that's connected to different, chants or often very long narratives about their life stories. This is the first one that features kidney stones. I will say that. Also, and maybe we'll talk about it someday in detail, but not a professor who was fleeing the coup, but the book In the Parish of the Poor, that Aristide book was immensely influential on me as a late undergraduate, and I've always thought that was the seeds of my own interest in Black studies. So I think Aristide's really underread. I mean, he's known as this former Haitian president who was couped by the United States and various other nefarious forces. But that's a work that I would love to see start to get some hearing. But there's so much that goes after that. So I'm also curious what sort of sustained you this interest, right? You have this spark, this thing that the pamphlet. I assume that was your Mellon Mays program.
Yeah.
So
it was the Mellon Mays program. It was the Mellon Mays. What was then the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship Program. And then there was also a program very formative for myself called the Leadership Alliance, which was not a program that was throughout the year, but it was a program at initially a cluster of colleges and universities that has since greatly expanded. And that was specifically one in which you applied and then would work closely with the faculty member for the summer. And so the two of those programs together, the pamphlets really kind of set the stage. Yeah.
So when you think about the field of Black Studies, I know you spent a good bit of your career in Black Studies departments. And, having had this work as an undergraduate as well, that continuity, I think, is not actually common in the field of Black Studies. But I'm curious to hear how you imagine the field. What is the portrait of the field for you that you work with and imagine yourself sort of beholden to or connected to? Because it has a really interesting origin point, right? It has an origin point of the demand on college campuses to represent Black life, something that had been completely, neglected for obvious reasons in the American academy, right? That you had disciplines that had little to no study of Black life, and Black Studies comes in to develop an appreciation and extend the Black intellectual tradition in such important ways, and that demand was also, present at the time where campuses and communities around Black liberation struggle were having their relationship reconfigured by demands of students, but also of activists and community workers to say, the university needs to, that Black Studies is going to play this role of connecting the university, connecting classrooms, connecting students to political activism organized around Black liberation struggle. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, this is such vital energy on both sides. What's come from that, of course, is this question, is Black Studies more dedicated to the development of an intellectual tradition or to prescriptive interventions in liberation struggle and activism? But we're also 50-something years past that origin point. So this, for me, makes it really interesting to think about how we think about the field, what the portrait we have of it, in relation to this origin story. So how do you see the field and sort of specifically framed by this origin?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to begin to answer that question, one, in terms of how I have historically taught the Introduction to Africana Studies course, and then also, secondly, with an essay that Sylvia Wynter had written in 1984, published in 1984, called "The Ceremony Must Be Found." So those two things, and I think that I'll get to it. So in terms of teaching the class, and I realize at different campuses and institutions, some of the introductory courses might be Introduction to Africana Studies, Intro to Black Studies, Intro to Afro-American Studies, Intro to African and African-American Studies, and the like. But the Introduction to Africana Studies course, how I have tended to teach it actually just doesn't, it's not like, when one thinks of like Star Wars, the whole Star Wars series, and it's like in the beginning, it's not a kind of Genesis. It's, it's not like in the dawn of there was the Big Bang or there was a higher power created the universe. And then you go to the present. The course, as I have always taught it, starts in the period in which you talked about it. It starts in the late 1960s. And before we even get into what are we really going to do, I really start with not only material but also discussions on the what was the call for Black Studies, and I also relate that to the institution that I am kind of working at. So in the case of Williams College, it tends to surprise many people, that the kind of the debates and conversations that were occurring in the first kind of Black Studies program in the United States in San Francisco State College to the year were also occurring at Williams College. And so there was a moment, famous or infamous, however you want to think about it, that has been cataloged as the kind of the occupation of Hopkins Hall, which is actually the building I'm in right now, the administrative building. And so now, as you know, I've been working in the recent years as a senior administrator. But this building, Hopkins Hall, is where the president's office, provost's office, dean of the faculty's office, registrar, financial aid registrar, and the controller's office are all located, among other areas. It's also the building that in the late 1960s was occupied by students, predominantly black students, and also their allies, and they occupied the president's office and then issued a series of demands. Many, not all, that eventually were met, because what was initially Afro-American studies in 1968 at Williams was initially passed by the faculty with zero resources, zero FTE. Right? It was a Black Studies program in name only, and so part of this, not all of the occupation of Hopkins Hall was to make demands on the administration to support what was only passed in kind of in name. And that's really important, because it doesn't suggest that what was occurring at San Francisco State and the geopolitical circumstances and material circumstances at Williams College in 68 and 69 are the same, but it does suggest that the movement, because it really was a movement primarily of students, to have intellectual space to thoroughly investigate a series of questions, figures, movements that predate 1960, right? That predate the late 1960s. So in some sense, this is an atemporal version of the Star Wars point that I was making. That eventually, then you do get to the genesis, discussions of prior to the movement. But this is not the only way. But this is a way that I have approached it. So getting to that question in terms of, well, what do I think of the kind of the nature of Black studies? So in 1984, the Jamaican intellectual Sylvia Wynter, who incidentally, something that we've talked about for years, Wynter in different forms, in the novel form, plays, essays, right, interviews, has essentially been making the same core claims for decades. And I would go so far as to say Sylvia Wynter and also her briefly one-time colleague Cedric Robinson are two figures in Black Studies in 2024 who are now widely, right, discussed, who for much of their lives, even within Black Studies, folks didn't even want to teach them, right? Didn't even want to teach them. And in 1984, Wynter wrote an essay. It's a difficult essay, but it's one worth reading or rereading, called "The Ceremony Must Be Found." And as I understand the essay, what Sylvia Wynter was trying to think about was what she called the new studies, of which Black studies, Latinx studies, environmental studies, but much of the essay is focused on the Black studies movement. She was trying to figure out how does one think about the relationship of this movement to Black studies to the institutionalization of the field on various college and university campuses in the United States. So she goes into initially, she says there's this phenomenon that one can see where even the early departments, programs, and centers of Black studies or Africana studies or African American studies programs were literally physically in the kind of the frontiers of campuses, right? They were usually never in the kind of center, right? So there's a spatial, as what Charles Mills in the Racial Contract talks about now, the relationship between race and space. So there was not only a kind of a spatial distance, but there was also what Wynter talks about, the liminal, right? The kind of the Black studies in this liminal and heretical kind of position to the kind of normative order of the academy. And so how do we think about institutionalizing a field that grew out of a movement that on the one hand, there is a lot of promise in that actually having academic units and centers, right? At Williams and Amherst, at the University of Maryland, at Howard University, right? At various other colleges and universities across the United States. And with that institutionalization, if we warp, speaking of decades, a few decades later, Winter then writes another long essay, right, in which she reflects on Black studies. She reflects on Black studies years later, and suggests that prognostication that she was trying to talk about. She says, on the one hand, Black studies has blossomed, right, all across, and there's literally, as Hazel Carby once wrote, Carby said there's even a market, right? There's an actual market for Black studies by those who haven't even been connected to the field for years. But is there an underside? Is there an underside to that institutionalization that in some sense has made the liminal heretical field and those connected to it, has it maintained that original imperative, or has the market for Black studies been one in which it's created, a lot of careers? It has supported a really amazing initiatives, but has anything been lost? What Winter called, have we mistaken the map for the territory? Right? Have we mistaken the map for the territory? So back to how I see the field, I think what has been extremely important, and I think can't be understated, is that there has been not only the kind of the growth of Black studies programs, and I say departments, programs, centers, because the model of Black studies, right, has different institutions have different types of models, and I think that's really been commended. If we want to talk about, for those who are in the kind of professoriate dimension of Black studies, many departments and programs and centers had their kind of FTE lines. In other words, individuals, if they are hired, whether visitors or permanent faculty in some sense, the lines for so long were often in the kind of classical units, and that had some strengths, but that had some real kind of drawbacks. So there are one of the works that I always teach in the Introduction to Black Studies is a volume, I think, speaking of under discussed texts, it's a volume called Black Studies in the University. It was a volume, right, Black Studies in the University, that was held at Yale University, and it has a lot of figures now who were there. It was a student at the University of Virginia, Armstead Robinson, who eventually just essentially transcribed the text of the conference, and it had different figures: founder of Kwanzaa, Maulana Karenga. It had Martin Kilson. It had an individual, McGeorge Bundy, who was central to one of the main. He was representing the Ford Foundation at the time, and a scholar now at Brown University, who's the chair, Noliwe Rooks, wrote this really important book at one point about what is Black Studies relationships to foundations. Right, the kind of foundations, and a variety of figures. David Bryan Davis, kind of renowned historian of slavery. A variety of figures who were there, and they were tasked with answering the questions that you're talking about, right? But they were doing it in real time. What should it be? Should Black Studies, whatever that is, be connected to local communities? Should at the level of appointments? This was something that Martin Kilson, who I think is a pioneer, especially in the field of political science and the relation of Black Studies to political science. Kilson at the time in that conference made an argument that whatever Black Studies is in terms of appointments, folks should just have joint appointments. There should never just be a appointment in what might be Black Studies, or an appointment in a classical discipline with a kind of dependency relationship. Kilson was making an argument that there should be joint appointments. There are others who said, yes, there should be Black Studies units, but it shouldn't actually have to be predicated on a connection to community, local community, or community activism. Why should Black Studies, the argument goes, be any different than other fields in which they're about the intellectual study, not necessarily the relationship to kind of peoples and places, and a variety of all of these things. And I can't help but, when I think about this kind of sense of where are we today, I think a lot has taken place. One thing that I haven't mentioned is, I think the global nature of Black Studies has shifted, because much of the discourse was very African American in a U.S. sense, whereas now the Caribbean, Africa, Black Britain, Black Japan, Black Brazil, various other, I think put differently, Africa and the African diaspora is very much related. And so I'll kind of, if I can round it out, for me, there are three key questions that I have suggested animate the area of Africana thought. If we understand Africana thought to be thought connected to Africans and people of African descent in the wake of October 12th, 1492, when Columbus and crew thinks they're going to Asia and then lands in the Bahamas, that we not only see the kind of disease and conquest that and enslavement that related that ensued from that moment, but also the introduction of modern ideas of race and racial difference. But since that moment, I think there are really three key questions that continue to animate Black studies. One, we might call the identity question. The second, the equality question. And the third, the freedom question. So the identity question could be put short, tersely, however difficult it is to answer. Who am I and who are we? Right? Who am I and who are we? The equality question is important because oftentimes many of us conflate equality and egalitarianism. There are vertical notions of equality, which essentially are equality among equals, right? So there's a banal example and a more serious example. The banal example is, imagine in residential colleges, you have first years, second years, third years, and fourth years. And if one asks, do each of them have the same access to housing? Right, the same type of housing. Do first years have the same access to housing than the second years, and the second years to the third years, and the third years to the fourth years? The answer is usually no. A more serious example is when one thinks of the history of Jim Crow segregation in the United States and the separate but equal doctrine. Right, this idea that there are different individuals who were then hierarchically or vertically separated based upon their racial categorization, but the idea was within those different racial groups there was supposed to be the same access to resources, but not between groups. So a struggle for Black studies has and continued to be, how do we transform a vertically equal society to a horizontally equal society in which there's no barrier or exclusions? And then the final question, the freedom question, which put simply is, what do we mean by the idea of freedom? What does it mean to be free? What is the relationship between freedom to independence and emancipation? And how do we make sense, finally, between the relationship of different conceptions of freedom to different conceptions of enslavement? And I think this is important, not only for the field of Black studies then and now, but also if C.L.R. James is correct when he suggested in a lecture in London in the 1967, I believe, Black Studies and the Contemporary Student, when he was trying to wrestle with, someone asked him, well, James, what does Black Studies mean to you? And he says, I don't know. He's like, I don't know what it means to me, but he did say, in some sense, riffing probably off of June Jordan in some ways, of Black Studies is also life studies and human studies, right? That there's a way in which to study the Black experience and to study the figures, movements, and questions and concepts and struggles and aspirations of the material that is discussed and written about in the field, is to actually get at human history, and it's to get at not just death, but also to get at life. I think James and June Jordan were really getting at. It was to get at life.
So there's so much there. By the way, I like the political scientist in you, political theorist coming out in you around, let's be clear about what we mean by freedom. These are, freedom is such a potent word, of course, in a Black studies classroom. I think that kind of clarity is great. But also, as you say, it's at the heart of the field. It's part of the origins of the field, and therefore part of the demands I think it places on us. And I have to say, I think there are really important things to be written, talked about, gossiped about, however you want to think about it, around what you were talking about in terms of the spatialization and location of Black studies on campuses. I think about that a lot. I mean, look, University of Maryland, I don't know if my colleagues or anyone is listening to this particular moment in this podcast, but there's something really interesting that we are the back door to Francis Scott Key Hall. We are literally on the backside of a hall named for the author of the national anthem. So something for me, there's something really worth thinking about. I mention it to my students all the time, and we speculate and have fun with it. But there's a deep question there. I mean, we're right on the quad, so it's not actually on the margins of campus. But nevertheless, these spatializations, I think, are always very curious.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me switch modes and voices here and ask you about your own work. You know, you work at this really interesting intersection of political theory, Caribbean studies. I think especially in Caribbean studies, your work on Marronage, which is of course your book, but also your interest in teaching and writing on Rastafarianism as political theory. So I'm interested in how this mixture of voices and approaches, how you think it relates to the history of the field of Black studies. Yeah. Like, what is it? You know, is it a break from that, or is it embedded in something about the history of Black studies? And what new horizons do you think this collection of approaches and critical frames opens up for the field? What new horizons open up in your work?
Yeah. So, Frantz Fanon, in his first book, Black Skin, White Mass, which we've talked about over the years so much.
His
Fanon's
best
work,
book, his best book.
And he has that kind of that line, I'm paraphrasing, early on in Black Skin, where he says, when talking about method, and he goes, I'm not dealing with method, leave method to the botanists, And the thing is, Fanon actually does have a method, but he has that kind of tone in Black Skin, White Mass. Are we to take him literally, or are we taking ironically? But this actually does that kind of, I say that because this, in terms of thinking about my work, and then also perhaps how this might echo different debates and discussions in the field, is really is a methodological one, right? Which is that I think that much of my own work, and when I look kind of years back to periods where I had germs of an idea to when I really felt like I really started to find my voice on a series of topics. A lot of it was that I was trying to think about writing, for instance, to fit some type of model of what I thought a field was supposed to be, versus actually writing about what interests me, what actually are questions that, quite frankly, have been continued to be discussed. But it feels like, those moments, it feels like, gosh, the time is going on, and I don't know if anyone's really addressed it the way that perhaps it should be. Or there have been many meditations on a topic, but one might still want to try and say something original, or at least relevant, one hopes. And so when I started to shift to think about, well, what question or questions actually really animate it, I was drawn, as you know, particularly to that third key question, right? The central Black studies question that I was trying to pose. There's not just the identity question and the equality question, but the question of freedom. And once I started to, shift to how do we think about freedom, that then got me thinking about, well, who are the interlocutors that one might engage with in order to actually try and have a sufficient answer to that question. And so, as you alluded to, my kind of first major work, a book I published in 2015 called Freedom as Marronage, was one that initially, in some sense, flipped on its head how I'd been thinking about freedom for several years beforehand. Beforehand, I was in this kind of, I guess a little bit is aging myself, but in terms of, speaking of Haiti and especially the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, at least in philosophy, Africana philosophy, Africana political theory, and also kind of wider areas of theory, the Haitian Revolution was and had been discussed, but not necessarily in those realms. And I initially used to be in the camp that said something happened in colonial Saint-Domingue from 1791 to 1804 that never happened in human history and will never happen again. Now, to be very clear, there are many things that happened during the revolution that we should be continuing to write about and discuss and study and teach. But with regards to freedom, I started to think, particularly when thinking about kind of Maroons, right? Those kind of historically Maroons usually understood in two ways: either individual kind of runaways, who were during the period of transatlantic racial slavery, were either taking flight from a plantation either for an hour for some type of mental sustenance, or for to see loved ones on another plantation, or as has been captured in not only the kind of life and times of many kind of either fugitive slaves, and even some of the narratives based on those individuals who might have taken flight with the idea that there might be lethal consequences, but wanted to just simply kind of escape a territory. And then the second type, kind of Grand Marronage, this idea of those who thought that in their lifetime, that the idea of overturning a slave regime, or what I call a slaveocracy, was not possible. So what would it mean to then have a community of those who have taken flight and created some territorially bound space that would give a kind of qualified freedom, right? But when looking at the kind of Maroons in Hispaniola, and then also in the Circum-Caribbean, I began to think, well, what if we thought about freedom throughout space and time? So not only going to the past and also in the present, but also into an indeterminate future. What if we thought about freedom as the process of flight itself, from and trying to exit what Fanon called the zone of non-being, to exit a condition of enslavement, but I go back to also work such as John Hope Franklin, that Franklin was such a seminal figure in the institutionalization of Black studies as a field. Yeah. But Franklin also, with his important work from slavery to freedom, ended up actually reifying a view of freedom that actually I have come to reject, which is this idea of, you're from somewhere, you're from some unfree word, and you're moving towards somewhere else. Whereas I became interested in, what about the act of flight itself? Our attempts, regardless of kind of consequences. What if that is actually where freedom resided? And so that really led me on a quest to not only spend several years, even in the wake of that, thinking about how we get free, okay? To actually now, in the last few years, or the last decade rather, thinking a lot about, well, how do you and I and others live, even if we're not even living our condition of of the free, of the free life. And then one other thing, if you don't mind for me to kind of say, which is that much of all of this, going back to not only it's not a rejection of method, but also when focusing more on, well, what are the ideas or questions that we want to answer, that actually really got me very interested in and unsettling my own understandings of what are the forms of text that we use to do analysis at all. So there's the kind of written form, right? There's the oral form. There is the audio visual, right? There's visual arts. There are sages. There are different forms of communication that one has. There's also the metaphysical, right? Which is not merely the religious, right? There's religion, but there's also metaphysical understandings that individuals and groups have that may include, but are not that are irreducible to the idea of religion. And so I began to think a lot about what are the forms of text that we use. And so you mentioned my kind of work, and especially teaching on Rastafari. And so one of the projects I'm working on now is actually an intellectual biography of Haile Selassie, who is kind of a central figure in the Rastafari movement, and but also someone who is profoundly, there's very little understood about who Selassie was, and others.
He's a figure people only know about because other people reference him.
Yeah, they reference
in a
him.
song.
Yeah,
or in a political movement.
Exactly. And so and there's a whole bunch of things in between, but really just that was in terms of thinking about what has not only kind of preoccupied me for some time, is that, and then one other area which gets at that nexus of work that I've continued to work at the nexus of kind of political theory and Africana philosophy and Caribbean studies and modern political thought, which is kind of work that I've done in collaboration with my kind of friend and colleague Jane Anna Gordon, with a kind of a book series, Creolizing the Canon, that has attempted to engage an idea that emanated out of Caribbean thought, this idea of creolization, which itself, like many movements, intellectual movements, has various understandings of that. But how do actually we understand the idea of kind of creolization and mixture, not just as merely fixed, right? To not merely kind of, I always use the example of like 7-Eleven. I don't even know, at Maryland, do they still have where you are 7-Elevens? But right, the idea of,
right down the road
right,
from here.
the idea of Slurpee. So you go in the summer and then you go into a 7-Eleven and then you might not know what it is, but there's the purple stuff and you put that in there, and then there's the yellow stuff and the red stuff, and then and it all comes together. You get these fixed kind of elements, and then these two or more elements coming together, and then you get this, whatever it is, it might not have a name. You drink it, and it's 90 degrees outside Fahrenheit, and it's very refreshing. That's not how I think about creolization. I'm much closer to the work of someone who you've written extensively on, Edward Glissant, and I think Sylvia Wynter shares this as well, which is, what does it mean when two or more entities encounter one another that themselves were not already and forever fixed? And then what does it mean when these two or more entities come together and create something new, or what Hannah Arendt called natality, but that even into the future may undergo different forms of kind of transformations? Because how I think about social and political orders, it is, and Du Bois wrote kind of extensively on this, especially in Black Reconstruction in America, where one thinks about oftentimes that there's the kind of rise and fall of something, or you're going, and then there's a nadir, and then there might be a peak. But throughout human history, right, social and political orders align and realign. So going back to the Haitian Revolution, you have a revolution that was both dual anti-slavery and anti-colonial revolution that transformed the entire political order and fundamentally modernity as we understand it. But after that revolution, right, social and political orders, right, transform, and that there are kind of new masters and new enslaved. And so how do we think about these ongoing kind of dynamics in a way that is intelligible, in a way that that can make sense, and in a way that even if we don't have all the answers, at least it can get us to continue to kind of wrestle with these with these things together. And so creolization has been a framework to think about not only the work in Caribbean studies that I think we both share, that the contribution of Caribbean studies to the field of Black studies is very essential. And in that, going back to the origins in the early phases of the field, it was present, kind of, right? To a moment in which it's not only a central aspect of the field, but it's also it's continuing to kind of grow, but also the ways in which I think creolization allows us to understand a lot of developments in Black studies. And again, it's not applicable for everyone. It's not a framework that everyone uses, but it's one that has helped me to think about not only the idea of freedom, how do we talk about Rastafari, and how do we actually think about the ways in which even figures outside the circum-Caribbean are still nonetheless engaged in forms of creolized thinking that can be generative for us all.
So I would love to convince my department to hire some Caribbean studies people, so I'll have them listen to this. No, but it's interesting also for me hearing you talk about your interest in Marronage and the sort of distinctions internal to this idea, if you want to call it that, or critical frame of the Maroon. And how that, for me, has, and I know this is also the trajectory of some of your own thinking, not even trajectory, but sort of map of your own thinking, it reframes somebody like Frederick Douglass, who I think was either embedded in something like the story of abolitionism, right? The slave narrative abolitionism, or post Angela Davis's lectures on liberation really theorized in terms of a sort of dialectics of freedom, right, and violent resistance. But what I think that Marronage stuff that you were talking about helps us see is how a figure like Frederick Douglass also has this other story to be told about the meanings of the sort of time of freedom. Right? Is it always in this sort of abolitionist horizon, or is there also, as you were saying, these moments of personal and familial, right? That, what does it mean that Harriet Tubman comes back to Maryland after leading herself and others to freedom through the Underground Railroad? So all those ways that I think that notion of Marronage becomes not just a study of Maroons as a sort of Caribbean phenomenon, especially famously in Jamaica, or sort of site specific, and instead reframing these key figures in the Black intellectual tradition. And so I love that as a way of pushing horizons that is also so deeply embedded in the past.
Yeah, and I think in terms of what you just said, it's not insignificant that Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were both enslaved persons in Maryland, and I think there's speaking of the future of Black studies and studies, I'm hoping that there will be more attention to also the kind of significance of Maryland, especially in the 19th century, to a lot of discussions that we're having right now, but also amidst what you were just saying, because Frederick Douglass particularly, but also Angela Davis are two figures who have kind of written a lot about, and I think contemporary discourse on not just the theory, but also the kind of politics of abolitionism, right? Kind of 20th century abolitionism, particularly with regards to the topic of and phenomenon of mass incarceration, not exclusively, but there's a lot of discussion with regards to abolitionism that often pits abolitionism on the one hand and a kind of reformism on the other. And I think if we actually look at certainly Davis, but if we go back to the 19th century and look at the not just the experiences, the writings, the kind of the speeches, the organizing of Frederick Douglass, I think Douglass's own transformations on topics, right? His view, initially Frederick Douglass, when Douglass publishes in 1845 the first of his three autobiographical slave narratives, Douglass is still a Garrisonian abolitionist. He's someone who thinks not just thinks, but makes an argument that the U.S. Constitution is a pro-slavery, right? It is a pro-slavery, document. And then by the time of his second autobiography, in My Bondage and My Freedom, a decade later, still at that point, still a fugitive enslaved person, but then has this break with the Garrisonian abolitionists and starts to rethink not only documents such as the U.S. Constitution, however imperfect those documents are or were at the time of Douglass's kind of writing, but also this sense in which the insights of kind of fugitivity also have ramifications on how we think about socio-political matters that have actually been and continue to be an ongoing preoccupation of Black studies. And I think that abolitionism, especially with regards to the death penalty, and also with regards to contemporary jails and prisons, and then just the wider sense in terms of, well, how does abolitionist politics, to what extent does abolitionist politics connect to the history of Black studies? And is there a singular way to answer this, or is there an understanding of abolitionism that itself has been undergoing kind of transformations? I mean, there's no one answer to it, but it is one that I think has to be understood with the particularly debates between the 17th and 19th century that I think are still have ramifications for looking outward, looking kind of forward.
Yeah, and because this came up and I was rereading the book a couple of weeks ago for a project, parts of the book, Nick Brommel's recent book on Frederick Douglass is so good for setting the stage of intellectual development. But, Nick's not here, too bad, but I just wanted to give his book a shout out on that. Well, you've talked a lot about, sort of political science, political theory, freedom, Marronage, your work, the field of Black studies. So maybe in this sort of mode of assessment, I wanted to shift a question and ask you, and I think this is a particularly interesting question to ask you because you're now working, as a title associate dean?
Yeah, so associate dean of the faculty,
at Williams College. You've also, of course, been a faculty member. So this, for me, is a really interesting question to ask you in your position, having held multiple positions in relationship to higher education. What do you think that Black Studies has done particularly well? But also this question of what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah. So in terms of what I would say in terms of that I tend to not be an either or thinker in general, but I do think that Black Studies has had great success in not only going back to that, the winter ceremony must be found, something that I didn't mention, that Winter makes an argument before, a prognostication, which is that Winter made a prognostication in 1984 that perhaps Black Studies is not merely only about creating what was then and developing a new field of inquiry, or it was neither that nor only just about attention to classical disciplines and having them have responsibilities in terms of their curriculum. I think Toni Morrison's the Unspeakable Things Unspoken, right? That kind of lecture that Morrison gave, where she talks about, this is around in the wake of the publication of Beloved, and a lot of literary fame that would kind of ensue for Toni Morrison. But Morrison talks about the word canon, spelled two A's, CANON, and then CANNON. This idea, when she was talking about literature, she said, I think Morrison and Winter were actually aligned in the sense of, should something like literature or the field of English or literature, depending on the names of a unit, should it simply be about inserting a few additional texts in an otherwise kind of existing kind of canon, or should there be some responsibility within those fields to kind of transform? I think what Winter was saying was both of those things should happen. But I think this actually connects to not only what has been done kind of, I think, brilliantly in Black Studies across the United States, is that I think that the not simply either or, I think actually there has been a tension in terms of the kind of the curriculum and the institutionalization of Black Studies and the development, that these questions, both in the development of Black Studies programs, departments and centers, have really proliferated and have also increased questions on the responsibility of other units to also think about how they should transform. An area that I wouldn't call a lack of success, but I would reframe your question slightly to say what I think has not been an area of attention that I do think needs to have more attention is, and this does implicate myself, which is that we are at a stage in Black Studies and higher education where many scholars who themselves kind of professionally have been central to the field, or who have been working in the field, have found themselves or currently find themselves also in kind of senior administrative positions. And by senior administrative positions, I mean at institutions, the presidents, provosts, dean of the faculty, associate deans of the faculty, offices of institutional diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also in different forms of leadership positions across the institutions, and the question becomes, or at least what I think, which hasn't really been asked, it's only been kind of whispered or discussed on a case-by-case basis, should an issue arise, is what is the relationship of Black Studies to institutions, right? To institutions themselves, and also for those Black Studies scholars who find themselves or may find themselves also in senior administration, what is their relationship, right, to the to the field, right? Especially in the latter, where you're representing not just one field, you're representing an institution and the priorities and the functions of those institutions. And so, what do I say? Going back to that one of the early summer programs that professor who said that I might want to look into, there's a really wonderful program called the Leadership Alliance, and it was very new at the time. It's a program that was then encouraging students from historically underrepresented groups in the academy to consider kind of master's and PhD programs in a field. And so if you applied to one of the kind of networked schools, you would then be paired with a faculty member who agreed to work with one of the Leadership Alliance students for the summer. So I ended up one summer doing a Leadership Alliance program at New York University, NYU. And in that summer, the coordinator actually introduced us to different people in the field. So I had the pleasure of working with a scholar by the name of Renee Blake, who is an African American linguist. Who was the first Black woman to receive a PhD in linguistics in the United States. And at the time, the movie Beloved had not come out. So in the summer, Renee Blake had actually been given by Toni Morrison and I believe John Demme is that right? John Demme was the director of the film and was given the manuscript of Beloved, and so they wanted a linguist to actually go through for the diction, 19th century diction, all of these things. So part of the Leadership Alliance was working with a faculty member and then them helping you also out on your project. And so I had worked on this, but at the time, Robin D.G. Kelley was still at New York University. And so Kelly had actually given one of the kind of seminars. And that was my first time, again, I was very new to the field, so I didn't know who all the different figures were, but I was really moved by what Kelly had presented, because then he was actually jointly in Africana Studies and History at NYU. But he presented an aspect then of what he has since expanded upon, which is and other figures such as Fred Moten and Saidiya Hartman to some degree, but especially kind of Kelly, who had then and has a view now, unless I'm misinterpreting it, in which they said, having a faculty position on the college and university campus, no problems with that. But that's not where real transformation is going to occur through, right? That what Moten would call in Harney the undercommons, these spaces that are outside of the college and university, that's where actually the real heretical and radical kind of work of the original imperative of Black studies. And it's not that we can't do really important work in the colleges and the universities, the argument goes. And I believe there was a Boston Review forum with Kelly as a lead essay that had a bunch of respondents. It was called Black Studies, Black Struggle. I often teach that in the introduction to Africana Studies. There are a lot of contributors who agreed with Kelly, others who disagreed, some people in the middle. I think I've learned so much from Robin Kelly, and I think we all have. I think this is one friendly area of disagreement, which is that, and this is just having spent a long time, as you have, in the trenches, right? In department program meetings with centers, in meetings with students, in thinking about not just resources, but what do you want? What is necessary to do the type of work that we are trying to do? And in many campuses, it is the case that there are certain campuses that there are individuals who were not supportive of that work. It is also the case that there are many campuses in which there are not administrators who actually understand the work, right? Who don't understand this. Yeah. There's so many dimensions.
The hard part.
There's so many dimensions. So just if you indulge me just a little bit. So let me give you some examples. So for instance, in our office, the dean of the faculty's office, all of the department, all the faculty, we kind of work with all of the faculty at the college, all of the department chairs. Williams has a very unique structure, which is athletics. Actually, since our head coaches and assistant coaches are actually simultaneously assistant professors of physical education because we have a physical education requirement. Our office also does our office does all of the hiring for all of the coaches as well. Okay, so when you are talking about evaluation or things such as kind of tenure and promotion, and as we know, those processes, for instance, for tenure track or tenured faculty going through different ranks, or even coaches going through different forms of evaluation, if there's forms of evaluation that require external readers, right, external readers to read your work, we rely, of course, on units expertise to make those recommendations, but the office also ultimately has jurisdiction in terms of ultimately kind of deciding in a lot of those areas, different readers. One would hope that you actually have administrators who either have different areas of expertise in different kind of fields, or even if they don't in fields, in that example, who are able to ask the questions, right? Who are able to ask the questions, just to clarification questions, are able to provide support or provide kind of direction that will then ultimately kind of be the benefit of candidates, be the benefit of units, be the benefit of centers, and the like. I was just using one example, but this goes in a lot of different kind of areas. And so I think that we are at a moment, and we've been there at a moment in which I think it would be helpful for us to really consider, what is the relationship of the field to institutions, right? That's the first kind of, I think, big one. What is then the relationship to administrators? In others, are administrators the enemy, right? I mean, I'm just being crude here, but
Sure.
are administrators the roadblock to the achievement of the types of initiatives that Black Studies programs and centers are seeking to achieve, or can they be partners? And there is a very tricky but still important question to be asked in terms of kind of Black Studies scholars who either currently or are thinking about different types of leadership roles. While your leadership role is one in which you are working on behalf of all the faculty and all the members of the community, to what extent is your expertise and your kind of position one in which one can kind of support or make or bring to bear, right, a certain type of expertise to raise questions in conversations that may have as a consequence, right, different types of effects for units such as kind of Black Studies units. And so these are, I know that's another podcast in and of itself, but I do think in terms of that question of, I don't know if I would say what is the field done kind of good or bad, but I do think that there is perhaps no surprise that among the main kind of theoretical spike in theoretical works within the field has been with regards to kind of Afro-nihilism, Afro-pessimism, right? A kind of questions of not only anti-Blackness, but a sense, right? A kind of a sense in which not just kind of outside in the outside world, but also even within campuses, even in the wake of the movement for Black Lives, there still is areas of understandable distrust, right? That we have to think through, going back to the origins of the field and the developments, and acknowledge those developments that have happened, but also think about what are the challenges in 2024, 25 going forward. I think that we have to have a robust conversation of Black Studies relationships to institutions, and that's not just senior administrators. I think it's about actually institutions, and that is not to suggest that also that type of work that's occurring outside the university should not continue to kind of go on. But I think it's one in which for those of us who do work in Black Studies within the context of a university environment, because Black Studies is irreducible just to the university. But for those of us who are in it, I think that that's a question that even at that Rethinking Africana Studies, Rethinking Black Studies gathering years ago that you mentioned, that you opened with, we did a lot there, and it was wonderful. But that was actually that was a question that I wasn't even in a position to reflect on, because there felt like there was so many things to grapple with before that, but when I look back, I wondered, maybe that was something that it might have been good to broach.
Yeah, I mean, it raises this question. I mean, we're by the time yours comes out, probably 60 podcasts in, and a regular theme that comes up is, of course, about the relationship to the university, institutionalization, and so forth. And I like that there's a sense of tension. I mean, that's tensions are productive. They reveal things and so forth. And I think there's also, as when you mention Moten and Harney and the notion of the undercommons, I think that's inspired this sort of return to the community work of Black Studies, that works both on the edges of and then off the imaginary campus, right? I think as much imaginary as anything else. I mean that in a positive sense of like how we imagine where study happens. Yeah. But you really raised that question. I'm really glad that you did about, I'm going to come back to your image of the roadblock, administration as a roadblock. And that is really true. I mean, I think about so many cases of this. But one of the things that you can do with that image of a roadblock is think, well, what about alternative roads? Or what about the breaking down that roadblock? What do we want that road after the roadblock to look like? Where it's not a checkpoint or a roadblock, but a path towards what? That's a really hard question when you work in a field that has always understood itself as on the outside, but starts to become more and more on the inside, to see only roadblocks and not make demands for a transformation on the administrative side, or even to imagine what that might look like. I'm glad that you bring it up because, for what it's worth, I think that's a failure of our imagination. I would put that on myself. I don't think about that very often. I have a lot of criticisms. If someone were to turn around, because every once in a while you will get a dean or associate dean, assistant dean to ask you, well, what exactly are you looking for? That can be baffling, right? Outside of platitudes. But I think Black Studies is the place to ask that question because it's a place that isn't only interested in literature, visual arts, history. It's interested in all those things. So let me ask you a sort of final question, and maybe that's the answer, but maybe there's also another, which is, what do you think is a question we should be asking? What do you think is the thing we should be thinking about in the field of Black Studies today?
Mentoring. And what I mean by that is that I go back to that professor that I fortuitously happened to take that course in African American literature with. And they were a visiting professor. They had no obligation to me, right? To this teen. I think I was, 17, 18, something like that, right? They had no obligation to me. And they chose nonetheless. They saw something in me that I didn't even recognize in myself as potential. It wasn't a demand. It was simply a gesture to say, this might be something that you're interested in. If you are, I'm happy to use, John, what you just said, your path. I'm happy to not dictate your path, but I'm happy to kind of be there for you. I think it has always been going on, but when we talk rightly so in so much of the struggles that we continue to kind of face, but there's been so much generosity in the field from its inception. There's been so much generosity. In many regards, it's the work that a lot of wonderful people have been doing for decades that will often not even get uttered or written about, that is actually really important. And so I actually think, and maybe this is actually kind of putting my deaning hat on right now, which is that because much of the work that I do, though heavily focused within this campus, is on different forms of kind of mentoring programs, right? There's programs within a unit. There's programs of how do you have faculty members have mentoring by colleagues outside their department, because that allows for certain types of free flow of your views that doesn't have a kind of, and then mentoring also more recently in terms of for kind of pre-tenure faculty to kind of scholars outside of the campus, et cetera. But with Black Studies, I think there's different forms of mentoring that this happens. We see this in journals, we see this in, identifying their students, even undergraduates, right? They might have written this amazing kind of paper for you, or there was something that maybe one wants to kind of recommend them for, doing an essay or a book review or an internship, or connecting them with other kind of colleagues in different spaces that are not just university spaces. I think of, what's been really important in African and African American letters is, for instance, in DC, right? The National Museum of African American History and Culture, that a lot of the work in Black Studies is also being connected to these institutions of public good, right? That certainly have their specialists, but they're also actually other ways of having students who might even not even be majoring or concentrating in Black studies, but they have taken a class with someone working in the field, for instance. That I think actually being much more intentional in terms of the types of mentoring that have been going on for numerous years, I think is so I realize you probably asked a question where maybe asking like what intellectual concepts or material
that was a broad question. Absolutely.
But for me is that actually the piece on mentoring, not only having even more of a conversation or spaces to share who were people who actually mentored us in different ways, whether or not it was through something formal or whether it was or just the generosity. And then also the more systematic, like getting, being actually, what are things that work? There's even specific programs that well-intentioned that don't work as don't have the anticipated kind of goal. And so all of those things, because if I've learned anything from the not even intentionally being in the field that we call Black Studies to as the years have gone on, is that I would not be telling the truth if I simply said, "Oh, well, I did these things, and here I am, John, here I am, John."
Absolutely.
There's instance after instance after instance after instance of other people, family members. Many of my kind of books that ended up being central to Black Studies were even visiting friends' homes, and then I said my interest, and then a parent or guardian just saying, "Here's this, marked up book, like from decade. Here, read. You should read this one time," and then only years later being like, "Oh my goodness, this was." They were looking out and then constantly checking up. How are your studies going? How are your this? How is your family? How is your fill in the blank? But actually, I'll end with actually having, within the spaces that we operate. I know the spaces that I operate, and the spaces that I operate are that I'm perhaps can be of most support to those in the field or potentially in the field, is to not only utilize the resources that I have, but also help to kind of mentor in different varieties of ways. Colleagues and people I encounter at different levels who might have a germ of an interest in Black Studies to, they're working on their 5th book, but it's going in an area that they are seeking another intellectual community or different interlocutors. How can we, do so? And then I'll end with, that not only can we all be mentors, but we can continue to be mentored, right? That at least for me, how I understand education is how I understand education, especially teaching, is coming from a fundamental premise that there's material that we may use that we can share with others, but that I believe I and we all are constant learners. We're constantly learning. I'm constantly learning now. I'm learning from your podcast interviews that you're doing. I'm learning from comments in this conversation, and I'm learning from the work that people are doing in their different ways. And so that's how I would say what should we think about that is urgent, the mentoring dimension, because I actually think the mentoring at varieties of levels and being mentored actually then filters into all the questions that we have asked or tried to broach today. It has a consequence in all of those things, even when we don't know it.
Yeah, well, I love that. It's a fantastic place to end. I mean, we've all been mentored in multiple kinds of ways, and honoring that is so important. And I'll just say, as I was listening to you talk about this, I think about, what are the things that drew me and sustained me to Black Studies. I'm not the subject of the interview or conversation, but it's been the commitment of the field, top to bottom, in terms of the highest ideals to the everyday practices, to a sense of humanity. And I don't know that travels across all disciplines. And I think area studies generally, and Black Studies in particular, has that level of commitment to humanity and that question of mentorship as well as leadership, which you talked about before. The way these are connected to this to this common commitment in the deepest sense to the humanity of Black people, right? To the humanity of those who are around us. Mentorship is such a wonderful way to intervene. It's absolutely it's one of those that has no downsides, actually.
Right.
When we mentor as humans, rather than like, how can I give you the techniques to get tenure? But
that's right. That's right. Those are can be very related in part, but also distinct, right? Those things,
we could do both. So.
Yeah, you can do both.
Well, thanks so much for your time, Neil. I really appreciate it. This has been super interesting. Like I said, we go way back at this point, and I love being able to pick up so many of those themes from that early conversation between all the, Brown University, Amherst, Williams, others, Wesleyan, to talk about those themes, but also talk about them with so many years of both friendship, but also our shared experience in the field together. And in my mind, I'm replaying all these conversations, and it's a really wonderful thing. And this will be great to get out into other people's ears as well. So thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thank you, John, for having, for your ongoing friendship first and foremost, but also the really important podcast that you're doing, because I think this is a value to us all. So thank you.
All right. Well, take care, and you have a good rest of your day.
All right. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.